Well, hey, all you wiretappers out there. Gary Jenkins here, retired Kansas City Police Intelligence Detective. Back here in the studio, I want to tell you a Kansas City story. I don't often do Kansas City stories, but I like to do one every once in a while. And this is a story of, give you a broad overview. This is a story of a grassroots entertainment district development that was really ruined by the mob. Urban renewal, mob bombs, a lot of stuff going on in this. Murders. There was an area close to the city market. It was along one street called Delaware, which was on one side of the city market was Little Italy, where all the mob guys, their families first moved to, where they first got their first jobs is at the city market. On the other side, there's this street that had actually been the original downtown of Kansas City. The old city hall was on this street. A lot of big old brick buildings around here. But by 1971, 70, it was really run down and there was not much going on. Italian people had there'd been a highway that had cut down and taken out a lot of their houses and divided the city market from the rest of Little Italy. There was an easy way to drive through a couple of streets to get to city market. The mob had always hung out at the city market. They had a proprietary interest in the city market. Here's a former employee from down in this area named Chuck Haddix that will talk about this.
The city market was adjacent to the River Quay. And the city market traditionally had been run by the mob. And so the mob really wanted to get in on the action at the River Quay. You know, artists always lead the way to these kinds of grassroots development. Lou Merrick and Philomene Bennett opened their studio. And other artists, that attracted other artists. And then these entrepreneurs followed, these opening businesses in the area. And it really was a grassroots scene led by the artists. It's just kind of interesting. Ironically, once the area becomes successful, the artists have to go find another area.
Now, during this time, 1971, a man named Marion Trezzolo had a business down there. He was putting Teflon on pans, when the early people to do this, and he was making a lot of money. And he loved all these old buildings. They all had these great cornices and doorways, and he loved that old architecture and loved these old buildings. And you could rent one, or you could buy one, or get a long-term lease on one for practically nothing, because everybody was moving out. Like I said, the early 70s, white flight was in full bloom. After the riots of 68, people were leaving downtown. They were moving out. The businesses were moving out of downtown. It was really, there wasn't much left. We had one department store by then, a Jones store, I think. Maybe there might have been a Macy's, but then they did hardly any business. And the government buildings, of course, they were the big employees downtown, but a lot of apartment complexes and office buildings were being built out in the far suburbs, and businesses were moving out there. Downtown was dying in 1971, 72. Well, Mr. Trezzolo wanted to fix up an area down here by the city market. It was adjacent to downtown, within walking distance of downtown, the city center, the 12th and Oak and Main, and the police department, and the Jackson County Courthouse, and the big federal building, and a bunch of high-rise office buildings that at one time had been filled with lawyers' offices and other businesses down there in downtown. He started buying these buildings or getting long-term leases on them and hiring young guys to go in there and just gut them out. And he used the exposed brick and the old wood floors, the old wood ceilings, beams in the ceiling. And they were cool. We had never seen anything like that. And then he started leasing them out to restaurants, young people that wanted to start a restaurant. He had really inexpensive rates because he had very little invested in these buildings. Art studios, art galleries, little boutiques, other restaurants, a really cool restaurants started popping in because people, they could take a risk now. I remember this one guy, Ellie Cohen, I think this dude's name. I got to know him. See, I had a district car around there, and so I'd stop in and talk to these different people as they were putting these businesses up. Just, and they were fun. They were fun, young people, and had a lot of enthusiasm. So Ellie Cohen, he started a restaurant called Cindy's Bedspread. He had about 20 different hamburgers with 20 different toppings to put on them. We never heard anything like this in Kansas City. At this point in time, throughout the 50s and 60s, we had steakhouses, of course, because we're steak capital of the United States at the time. We had cafeterias, we had diners, we had little greasy spoons, and we had some bars and a couple of kind of nightclubs that had nice restaurants and a nice club that people went to. So and those were all closing up in the center city, particularly, except for the chili parlors too. We had 2 or 3 chili parlors. That was a big deal. Barbecue wasn't even a big deal then. There was barbecue, but it was over on the east side, and hardly anybody went there unless you were really, you worked over in Midtown. You were a working guy over in Midtown. You wanted this huge big lunch or dinner of barbecued ribs or something. The mob is watching all this as this guy is building up this area, and it becomes immensely popular. I can't explain it, but it was like they had several clubs that had bands, and young people started going my age. I was 26, 27 years old, and all us baby boomers started going down there and partying. And they were the kind of the first singles joints, if you will, before discos, after kind of the old nightclub with jazz and that kind of a thing. Like this was, they had modern bands. I remember this one place, Ebenezer's, Irish guy named Mike Ryan had it. He had and he gutted out the inside of this big building, and in the center there was an old office. It was just a freestanding building, and he put the band on top of it, and then all around it there was a bar, and then all the rest of it was all seating areas. Really cool place, and so it was starting to pop. And during this time, there's a guy named Freddie Bonadonna saw early on this was going to be a going Jesse. He was one of the first restaurant and bars down there. He had an Italian restaurant, of course, and he had a Italian restaurant a few blocks away south of downtown. There's only 2 or 3 Italian Gardens was downtown. Then Freddy's, I can't even remember the name of that club or that restaurant now. Mom did the cooking, typical joint like that. Mom does the cooking and brothers and sisters work in there and to keep it going. So he buys a spot down there and he calls it Poor Freddy's. And he becomes kind of a mover and shaker. I remember we used to work off duty down there, and Freddie, we'd go into his joint, and he'd just get cash money out of the till and pay us for just walking around providing security, because there really wasn't much going on. It was just a lot of young people having fun. It was a great place to work off duty, I'll tell you that. Tons of girls down there, tons of single girls down there going to those joints. So, we were all young, in our prime. What are you going to do? The mob's watching this, of course. Matter of fact, Corky Sabella, the boss of our brother, Nick Sabella, once went into Freddy's and said, you're an idiot. There's nothing going on down here. You're never going to make any money. Then as this starts going, and pretty soon they realize that there's big crowds coming down here Wednesday, Thursday, Friday night, and Saturday afternoon and Sunday afternoon, because they're doing a lot of things to try to get family people coming down. This Marion Trezzolo, he really kind of let his other business go and took over management of this whole area. He bought a double-decker bus from England, and we're taking people on tours out of there to downtown and around Kansas City. So it was hopping, and everybody knew it was hopping. Corky came back in there one time, and Freddie says, "Hey, Cork, how you doing?" "I'm doing okay." He said, he said, "This area, boy, it's ain't nobody making any money down there, boy. Sure, I'm sorry I started this club down there." Corky just like, and he was mad. I don't know if this had anything to do with what's going to happen later on, but I know he was kind of bucking up and making Cork, kind of playing the dozens on him, like, "Oh, you idiot. I was one of the smart. You're the one that's stupid." So the Sabella family, all right, I need to talk about the mob family, which felt like they had a proprietary interest in the market. So the Sabella family, Nick Sabella was the boss. He was a guy that never hit the joints at night. He read, he studied, he was canny. He was a good management guy. He was, he only worked through his brother Cork and his underboss Tuffy DeLuna. You did not talk to Nick Sabella unless you were just, joking around or something. As far as business, he only worked through these guys. His underboss Tuffy, he had a kind of a crew, a guy named Charlie Mortina and a couple other younger guys. This was really the Kansas City's hit team. They also kind of oversaw that another guy that was involved with them, Frankie Tucson, and later Pete Simone, who ran all the sports gambling. And out of that, of course, you get loan sharking and bust out scams. But when you got into the lower level enforcement out of those operations, the higher end, they also handled the money out of Las Vegas, the skim. When that started flowing in, this higher end, Tuffy DeLuna and Cork, Charlie Mortina, they knew about that. These lower level guys didn't know about it. So on the lower level, you had Willie Comisano, who had a big crew. He would be a capo of a big crew who had really handled all the street rackets, hijackings, boosters, to who was fencing, who wasn't, who got the records from the boosters. Arsons for hire, strip clubs, loan shark collection, any enforcement activities among all these minor criminals that are out making them all money. That fell to Willie Comisano's crew, and he had a son who was about my age, Willie Comisano Jr., who was moved on up into that and became a made guy and was involved with several murders. And Willie's crew was really involved with in those kinds of activities, unless it was at a certain level. There's a whole nother level that's close to Nick Savella that Tuffy DeLuna's crew took care of. Now, there were several bars. Now, we got the River Quay going, right? This is right north of downtown, around the city market. But there's an area called West 12th Street at the time. It was about 6 blocks west, say, of Main Street, 6 to 8 blocks west of Main Street. That had historically been, there was the municipal auditoriums there. They built Bartle Hall, which is a big convention area. Historically, this had been the lower rent clubs where they have go-go girls and kind of as my friend Phil Cardarella, a local lawyer whose dad was a mob guy, says,
they thought the way you made money off a bar was the way you made it. They made it on 12th Street, which is you get truck drivers visiting the city to buy expensive watered down booze for 50-year-old whores. They had no idea what a singles bar was.
So these kind of low rent West 12th Street joints where a lot of Willie Comisano's guys had joints down there. Lonnie Roccaforte, Johnny Green Amaro, Joe Comisano, Willie's brother, and a couple of other guys. And Johnny Green Amaro is going to come back into this thing. Johnny Green is kind of an interesting guy. He, you know what he specialized in? Only out here in the West, shall we say, stealing saddles, and had guys that would go to horse shows and different places where there were horses and big horse barns. We have horse farms here in the city, out in the suburbs, steal saddles and other tack, steal horses, high-end horses. So he was like the original Old West kind of a guy, although he was a city guy. He also developed what they called the Johnny Green ignition switch. Now, I don't know if he really did that, but this is what the bomb and arson guys used to call the Johnny Green ignition switch for an arson. They would take a gas pipe loose, let the gas start, take a lit cigarette and stick it into a book of the folding book of the throwaway matches, gopher matches, we used to call them, got light one and go for another, stick it in that book of matches, let the cigarette burn down while the gas is filling up the room. And when the cigarette burns down to the sulfur on the matches and it flares, and that flare will then explode the gas that's already burned down there or down there. And there's like the best the fire department can do and our bomb and arson guys can do is they go find where a gas pipe has been unscrewed and taken loose. And many times there's enough of an explosion, they're not even going to find that. And this will come into play here in a little bit. So West 12th Street, I remember I first came on, I rode around the area and we had a few calls in there during, I was working days. And then I had a footbeat. I didn't work footbeat all the time. I filled in for the West 12th Street footbeat guy. He was really well known down there. And I'd go in different clubs and all those bar owners be trying to buy me a drink or give me a drink. And then one of the girls she was like coming on to me like crazy. But at least I had a little bit of sense when I was 26 years old. A lot of older guys than me didn't have that much sense. I know that. Success is coming to the River Quay area, just a few blocks north of this West 12th Street area. Well, there's a big remodeling, rehabilitation project going on to build something called the Bartle Auditorium, which was a huge convention center. It's about 3 blocks long. It's right next to our old convention center, which I mentioned before, the municipal auditorium. So they're redoing that. They're redoing an old theater down there called the Folly Theater, which had been a burlesque thing for a long time, for the last 20 years, and then goes all the way back to the 30s and 40s, where it was a burlesque theater when burlesque was a little different. And anyhow, they're rebuilding it or rehabbing it into a really high-end concert, small outlet for smaller groups and maybe the symphony and places like that. And there's going to be a hotel, a Marriott hotel was going down there in this one long block where all these clubs were, these go-go clubs or strip clubs, whatever you want to call them. There's a lot of money flowing into these guys to buy them out of their places, of course.
They spent $500,000, $750,000 in decorating little Las Vegas places down in the River Quay, thinking they could charge people $10, $15 to come in as cover charges to these great places.
Success is happening down in the River Quay. These guys see that and they think, we got to go down there. Freddie Bonadonna is going good down there, and he's going so good. He has a good friend on the city council, a guy named Hernandez, Frank or John, some common name Hernandez. Anyhow, Councilman Hernandez is his good buddy. So Freddie sees that these joints want to go in. And he knows that if those guys start going in the River Quay, it's kind of ruin the family atmosphere and the young people atmosphere that's going on down to the young working people, educated people, because they're going to start bringing in a different sort of a crowd. They're going to be a lot rougher crowd, and he doesn't want that. He didn't want to stop that family atmosphere because he can see it's really going. He goes to the city councilman and he starts feeding the city councilman background information on people that are applying for liquor licenses because they're convicted felons, so they apply for them under another name. And then he'll feed that info to the city councilman and he'll go to liquor control and they'll stop them from getting licenses. Now they end up with a workaround around that. And the mob, they've always got workarounds. There's a board, a politically appointed board that will hear appeals for any kind of enforcement activity that the city liquor control does, or appeals for if you get denied a license. So pretty soon they're getting their licenses because they're appealing to this politically appointed board. So they're starting to move in down there.
And 12th Street had gotten kind of tawdry. We're talking 12th Street downtown, and there was remnants of what had been 12th Street, and there was a lot of strip clubs down on 12th Street. Because of urban renewal, they were being torn down. And so, the guys, the mobsters that were in charge of that area had no place to go. They wanted to keep their hustle going. So where would you want to take it? You would take it to the River Quay.
Freddie has also, through his city council friend, he finds out there's a bunch of unused parking there behind his joint, between his joint and the city market. There's like about 2 blocks long area of parking that was for the city market, but it's never used except on Saturday mornings. During the week, it's barely used during the day, and at night, it's not used at all, especially Wednesday, big nights, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights, not used at all. So he gets a lease on these parking lots, and he starts putting a guy out there who will charge you a couple bucks whenever you pull in. I remember pulling in there, and this guy appears out of nowhere and said, that'll be $2. I'm going, what the hell? This is Kansas City. You don't pay to park here. He said, you're going to tow you off if you don't pay it. So you pay it. And he was making, probably $1,000 or so in cash money in 1974, 75 every week out of that thing. And Willie and Joe Comisano, Joe's got a joint going down there by now called Cotton Eye Joe's. And they see this money that Freddie's making out of the parking lot. Well, Freddie has a dad named David Bonadonna, who is a longtime mob guy since he was a young kid, a burglar, and raised a family, and all his kids were pretty well on the straight and narrow. Freddie was not involved with any shenanigans or with the mob at all, but David was, and he was a made guy, and he was in Willie Comisano's crew. Willie and Joe, they go to Freddie and say, we need a little piece of that action. You need to help our guys get liquor licenses down here, and you need to give us some of that parking lot money. Freddie says, no, I ain't going to do it. His dad, David, is a made guy in Willie's crew, so Willie talks to David and said, you got to get his guy to do it. Well, So here's former homicide detective Clarence Gibson talking about he was a family friend of the Bonadanas, and so they would confide in him about some of these things.
Now, this came from a relative. It didn't come from any police sources. It came from some of the family members I personally knew. David allegedly went and talked to Freddie. "No, Pop, I don't want him down there." So he came back, and he told Willie, it ain't going to happen. My son doesn't want to do it, and I'm not going to force him. And Willie has allegedly said, he could get hurt. David responded with, you're going to hurt my son, you got to come through me. Willie Comisano and Joe met with Nick Savella at the bar, I guess the one downtown, and talked about it. Nick more or less said, I'd give it a month. You guys try to work out. You can't work it out in a month. You do what you got to do.
Willie's threatened Freddie through his dad, David, and you heard what Clarence Gibson had to say about that. Freddie starts acting like he's helping with the liquor license, but he really isn't. Here's what former FBI agent Bill Owsley has to say about that.
Freddie Bonadonna was trying to keep the River Quay clean, wholesome, and open to family entertainment. That put him in direct conflict with elements of the organized crime family. Fred was determined that he was not going to give in. So he opted to play one of the most dangerous games you can play. Outwardly, he was going to help them. Sub rosa, he was going to resist them. So, for example, he went to the developer, Canizero, who had bought out Trozzolo, and he said, listen, I can't be there. I can't be open, but when these guys come in, I'm going to introduce them, and you're going to say you're going to back them. Once they leave, we have to resist them.
Joe Comisano, who was a brother to Willie Comisano, wanted to bring the Go-Go Girls down there, but he couldn't get a liquor license, because the West Side councilman, who was Freddie's friend from back in the day, kept him from getting it because he had something to do with the liquor control at that time.
The leader of that West 12th Street group was Joseph Comisano. His brother, William Comisano, was a major player in Savella's outfit.
We go along for a while, and Willie and Joe have really figured out Freddie's not helping him. His dad, David, told Willie Comisano, if you're going to hurt my son, you got to go through me. So he went through him. Willie's got a headquarters, a garage is all it was, that really nothing went on inside. He had some table and chairs and coffee pot and refrigerator and kind of a little office-like thing set up. And he would meet guys over there all the time. We used to watch this place all the time and see who Willie's guys were. And when they were coming and going, it was like his own little social club. We had the social club, the Northview, over in Little Italy. Well, this was Willie's social club. Well, it was just, 536 Monroe is all we ever called it. A citizen happens to see a green Mustang pull into that garage. David Bonadonna drove a new green Mustang. The same citizen happens to be out front when that Mustang backed out. Clarence Gibson reports that a different driver backed that out because that driver did not know how to drive a stick.
We were called to a green Mustang at 9th and Wabash, an apartment complex, and in the trunk was David Bonadonna. He'd been murdered.
Freddie was alerted to what was going on. He had been talking to us. He'd been talking to the police. We had given him, guidelines. He was watching himself. They couldn't kill him. But it went on, this stalking, this back and forth. To make matters worse, Fred had thrown in with a guy named Sonny Bowen.
Freddie starts laying low. I mean, what's he going to do? Now his dad's disappeared, and about 2 weeks later, they find his dad's body in the trunk of the car over in the projects, which were reasonably close. Freddie's, the gloves are off. Freddie's laying low. There's some mob associates that are kind of on the outs with the Savella faction, and they start hanging around Freddie's bar and restaurant. I remember this. We're going, what is Sonny Bowen and Mike Ruffalo and this Gary T. Parker and some of they were kind of in between guys. They were younger guys that were more like my age and around 25 to 30, professional jewel thieves and professional burglars and that kind of thing. And we knew that this Sonny Bowen was a pretty good thief, and he had a contract on him because somebody had already tried to put a bomb and the blasting cap went off early, and left some tissue and some detritus inside of his car. We knew there was a contract out on him. The Bureau had gone to him and said, hey, there's a contract on you. And he said, I can handle it. Don't worry about it. So these guys are hanging out. Cops are called up to Johnny Green's house, which is about a block from Nick Savella's house. Now, this is only a block from Nick Savella's house. In this little area we call Philomena Acres, had Nick Savella's house. Right across the street was Corky Savella's house. Right up the street used to be Highway Simone's house, Thomas Highway Simone, who was the old underboss. Now it's Carmen Savella's house, who is a nephew to Nick Savella. And then right next to Corky's house is his oldest son and Nick Savella's nephew, Tony Ripe Savella, who will go on and be part of the mob and do some time. And several other Nick Savella's driver, Pete Tamburello, lives down the street, and several other Savella associates live in this small neighborhood, suburban neighborhood. And Johnny Green lives about a block away. It wasn't all mob people up there, a lot of other, but primarily Italian people moved over from Little Italy and over from Northeast, where all the Italian people had first settled. It's their first move up to the suburbs. Johnny Green, he always would close up his club. Now he's down in the River Quay by now. He'd close up his club. He would go to this restaurant, which was on his way home. I believe it was a Sambo's. How many of you guys remember Sambo's restaurants? They don't call them Sambo's. I couldn't call them Sambo's anymore, but went to a Sambo's, which was open all night long. He would meet Joe Comisano and his wife, Doris, and they'd have breakfast after they closed their joints down. He'd do this all the time. He had a regular pattern of doing this. So once you get a regular pattern, dude, you better, if you're in this life, you better watch what you're doing when you're in this regular pattern. But people are people, and they don't do it. Left there, he drove on up to his house. He had a nice, at the time, a newer house. It's probably 60 years old now. It's probably 10 or 15 at the time. Had garage door opener, one of the early garage door openers. Pulled up in the driveway, opened the garage door, pulled in. Well, rather than just go ahead and shut the door after he got inside, he waited, probably got out, would then walk up to the back door and hit the button. He didn't do that. Big mistake was he didn't go ahead and start that garage door closing, because he might have been alerted to something, because Sonny Bowen and his fall partner, Gary T. Parker, who had done a lot of crime together, were hiding around the alcoves of the garage, and they just stepped up next to him and popped him with shotguns from both sides. Go back out, jump in their car and take off. And it's a typical, these guys were mob associates. They weren't mob members. They were associates. But they did the mob thing. They threw the shotguns away about 2 or 3 blocks away, and they dumped the stolen car not too far from that. So that's typical mob hit, a block and a half from Nick Savella's house. It was like a slap in the face to the Savella faction. To top it off, Sonny Bowen, he goes back down to Freddy's the next day, and there's this one guy who I mentioned before, Mike Ruffalo. He was reporting everything that he heard to the FBI during these years. He reports that Sonny Bowen and Gary T. Parker are both bragging that they're the ones that hit Johnny Green. Now, go figure that. 3 days later, they've got a wake for Johnny Green down at Sabetto's funeral home, which is down in the North End or Little Italy. Somebody comes in that night, we don't know who, or they call in or they do something, and they say, hey, Sonny Bowen is out at Mr. O'Brien's Tavern out at Armour and Broadway. It's about 25 blocks south of there, all by himself. His car's sitting out in front. They already obviously have a hit car lined up, a work car as they call it, and mask and guns, because they go right from the wake. 3 guys go right from the wake, jump in this car, head out. They go in the back door. There was a back door and a front door. They went in the back door of Mr. O'Brien's. 2 of them split off, point guns at the rest of the people in the bar to make sure there's no off-duty cops or anything that are going to try to be a hero. One of them walks right over to Sonny Bowen, and he's sitting in a booth all by himself, and pops him 2 or 3 times, kills him right there. Drive off, throw their guns away about 3 or 4 blocks away, drop the car off. So, of course, that was never solved. Actually, we never solved any mob murders in Kansas City. The Kansas City mob is tight. nobody ever talked, and especially about any murders. They talked about little things. This Mike Ruffalo, he talked about a lot of little things. He talked about one time Corksavella hired him and a guy that he worked with on a regular basis to go plant a stick of dynamite underneath a strip club owner's car and set it off in order to intimidate the guy because Cork wanted to muscle in on the strip club business. So little things like that, or the extortion of the parking lot money and little things like that. But when they did a murder, they included nobody that was ever going to talk, and nobody ever did. So the Bureau goes after this Gary T. Parker to try to get, maybe he's got something, and he won't talk about anything. They said, well, your buddy, Sonny Bowen, is dead, and you were part of it. We know you were part of that hit on Johnny Green. They can't prove it, or they would have charged him with it, but they know he's part of that hit because they've been bragging about it. But all they got is, secondhand bragging about it, no corroborating evidence. And he's uncooperative, and he's a drunk. He was a horrible drunk. He'd do drunken things. As at first they started trying to ride around with him and have another car behind him, trying to catch him, setting him up. Because we know that the Bureau has picked up from their informants and from some other wire that they had up that they're in a frenzy to go ahead and do Gary T. Parker. Parker is going out to clubs and he's getting so drunk that he's getting in fights in the clubs because he knows he's got these policemen and agents right there, and they have to throw him in the car and drive him back home and try to force him to go in his apartment. And one time, then they just quit riding with him. They just tried to stay behind him. One time he pulled over and jumped out and turned around and acted like he pulled a gun out and was pointing it right at the guys that were following him who had pulled over. He was just stupid like that. Finally, they just let him go. And the mob just lets him go at the time. We caught him one time, a guy named Vince Pacone tried to set him up with a meeting, set him up with a job or some money thing, kind of entice him to a meeting. And the Bureau found out about that and surveilled the meeting. And they saw somebody looked like a hit team coming into the area. But, those things are really hard. We had more than one example of them seeing us and a hit team seeing us and us not being able to react fast enough to get them stopped or do anything with them. And as soon as they see us, they're just gone. They'll give up and try again a week from now or a month from now. Everything's to their advantage, and they're sharp guys. These Sabella hit teams working under Tuffy DeLuna are sharp people. You don't want them after you. Seems like the mob just gives up on Parker T., although not really. Freddie Bonadonna goes into hiding during this time. He agrees to help the FBI with an extortion case on the Comisano brothers, Joe and Willie, trying to get them for extorting money on the parking lot situation. What's funny about that is Freddie said, there's one more parking lot about a block on down the street there that you could lease yourself and put your own guy in there and collect money on. But they didn't want to do that. They just wanted some of Freddie Bonadonna's money, wanted him to do all the work. Typical mob deal. You do all the work and give me a piece of your action. And it really was just because his dad was in the mob. He was never in it. He was never even close to it. And I don't think he ever depended on them for anything. He acted, against their advice, really, if you remember the deal with Cork, saying, you're not going to make any money down here. This is stupid. But Freddie has to go into hiding, and Freddie and his brother and another guy owned a large brick building in the River Quay. This is this ended the River Quay, that whole area that had so much promise and so many people were making a lot of money down there and helped to revitalize the core part of the city, bring people back into the city, get people to live down around there. He had this large brick building, and it had two clubs in it. There were mob associates, Pat O'Brien's, and Pat O'Brien was half Italian. He kind of modeled it along the Pat O'Brien's in New Orleans. He even had the hurricane glasses, said Pat O'Brien's on it. But he was a gambler, he was a sports gambler. He had actually been sent up to Council Bluffs, Iowa at one time. I think later on after this, he was sent up to Council Bluffs, Iowa with another mob gambler named John Costanza, and they were supposed to set up a sports book in Council Bluffs, Iowa, but some local guys intimidated him or something. They ended up coming back. There's a guy had Judge Roy Beans, a guy that owned it, ended up owning strip clubs ever since, and he was definitely a mob associate. So had these two joints running in it, they were way behind on their rent. They weren't paying their rent. They were behind on their liquor bills. Freddie's got $100,000 damage insurance policy on this building. River Quay's kind of going downhill, not much going on. He's not earning money out of this building. So the two mob guys are, they're making a little money, but it's not going to last. So what's going to happen? The whole building gets blown up. They say it was a battle over the River Quay, and I talked about this being the war over the River Quay and that kind of thing. And that was the image that this explosion gave to this area. This was nothing to do with any war. This was to do with insurance. It was a huge explosion. Here, listen to what the commander, Les Hash of the bomb and arson, had to say about that.
I received a call from the dispatcher about 2 o'clock in the morning, and she stated that there was 2 buildings that disappeared.
Nothing left but a huge hole. Aerial photo on the front page of the Kansas City Star showing this big hole in the ground. There was nothing but all the bricks that were in this huge big building were spread out for several blocks around, blew out all the windows around, and dumped everything else in the basement of this building. We took all those bricks and detritus out of that, spread them out down on the river levee where there was nobody along there, and we could spread them out and sifted through them, and we never found anything. Ran bob dogs over them, and they didn't trick to anything. I think, again, it was a gas explosion, probably with a Johnny Green ignition switch. Probably it just got too much gas in there. I don't think they really intended on blowing it up that bad, because somebody could have easily killed somebody. They happened to be walking down the street next to it. A lot of articles in the paper about David Bonadonna and Freddie, and there was another bombing on the back door of Joe Comisano's club, Cotton Eye Joe's, the Northview Social Club. Somebody had put a bomb on the back door of that. So people are nervous. Kansas City's quit coming into the River Quay. Here's what my friend Chuck Haddix had to say about that, and a pretty funny little story about this explosion.
I just cleaned up the bar, and I had my cash box in my hand from the bar receipts. And all of a sudden, there's this loud explosion. The building shook. I mean, we're talking railroad cars shook. There were these cooks and these bus people out in the car smoking pot in this car in the parking lot. And when the bomb went up, it blew the windows out of the car. And it dropped this heavy refrigeration unit right next to the car. If it hit the car, it killed them all. And they came walking in, beating on the back door, and they came walking in, and they were smoking. And I looked at them, and I said, man, that must have been some dynamite shit you were smoking. And unfortunately, that really marked the end to the River Quay. I remember the next day I went to work. People were driving through, looking at the crater, but people stopped coming down there, and the business dropped off greatly. And then Victoria Station, of course, closed pretty soon after that because there just was no business. People were scared to go down there.
So the River Quay's done. This whole area just goes downhill. They end up with a couple of strip clubs down there, some former bar owners from West 12th Street. Neither one of them are really successful. You can't get people to come down there like you could when it was over in downtown right next to the convention center. You got a strip club, those kinds of dirty bookstores and all that right next to a convention center where people walk out of the convention center. You see that within a block or two. You got something going, but this was like 8 or 10 blocks away from the convention center, and the whole area was just returned really to a lot of homeless guys, because there was a homeless shelter down there called the Helping Hand, and the people working at the city market, which it wasn't really a big deal back then. It was mainly just for businesses, for restaurants to come down there, and grocery stores, small grocery stores. And it was a produce market for them, but it really wasn't even for the public to speak of. Freddie Bonadonna has gone witness protection. He'll testify behind a screen in front of a congressional hearing on the mob in Kansas City, and explain about this River Quay thing, because it really set Kansas City back. I mean, since then, over the years, this whole River Quay area is now renamed the City Market, and of course they put condos and lofts and businesses, and it's just as hopping as it was back then. But it really stopped it for years. And all around Kansas City, all around downtown is taking on that same kind of thing as most big cities have. You know, the people, the lofts, people are moving back into downtown clubs, and we built a big new auditorium, a stadium, and for concerts, and we still don't have a sports team for it. But the T-Mobile Center, we have, Taylor Swift will play that 2 or 3 nights in a row, or Garth Brooks and those kinds of things, and a big. What they made an entertainment district just out of nothing, just tore everything down and built new buildings. And then all around that, it's kind of leached out into that. So the old buildings are still being redone. And in the city market, they're being redone, but it really set us back several years. Freddie, he being down in Naples, Florida, running a restaurant for the rest of his life. He'll sneak back into Kansas City once in a while, but he never really came back and showed his face. Of course, he lived in witness protection. He lived under that name the rest of his life. And I guess he didn't want to give up witness protection. He'll take his own life in 2002. So River Quay died. Since then, it's come back and it's jumping the whole revitalizing downtown. We've even got a light rail that starts down there and goes out south to the Union Station and goes through downtown and by all these other entertainment districts I talked about. It's hopping at nights. It's crazy. So this is a kind of an example of the mob and their greed and their way they do business of totally destroying a downtown area for at least a period of time. I know back in Boston, they tried to, and I remember they started talking about this as it went down, have a red light district where you have a bunch of dirty movies and show theaters. And we did end up with one down there, and strip clubs and all that kind of combat zone business. Now, it never went in Boston. They tried it in Boston, but it never really seemed to go. And it's really pretty distasteful. And it never really went in Kansas City. They did have a couple of those joints down there. And one of them, I told the story of the Bowery. They started having, even one night, tried to have a live sex act, except the dude couldn't get it up. I happened to be in there investigating the club that night. That was a hell of a deal. I remember this guy came off the stage and one of these jackoffs in the audience started yelling, you couldn't even get it up. What they did, they just simulated sex. And he said, you get up here on the stage and see what you can do. The guy shut up after that. So it got kind of crazy for a while, but it didn't last. That didn't last either. The Kansas City mob, all this time, got all this street stuff going on. There was 2 or 3 more murders after this that didn't have anything to do with the key, but they had to do with other stuff, with cleaning up old business that people they're afraid were snitches and that kind of thing. The FBI is frantically trying to put in some bugs and get on some wires. They've got informants talking about where they're having their dirty talk. Finally, they get a bug in and the mob, unbeknownst to any of us, for sure, other than by rumor, they're out here skimming money out of Las Vegas. And so this is really the precursor to that first bug that you see in the movie Casino. The reason they put that bug in was because of all this stuff I just explained, and one other mob war, which I'd have to have a whole nother podcast. I'll get around to doing it. I tell this in my movie Gangland Wire, and that I tell a lot of this River Quay stuff, and you can see a lot of good images and everything of it. It's a rental on Amazon for like $1.99. It's the first documentary I really made about the mob in Kansas City. So I suggest you see that. So that's the story of the war over the River Quay. So thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate y'all listening. I appreciate everything you do. Anytime you give me a like or you join my Facebook group, Gangland Wire Podcast. People send me money every once in a while. That's kind of nice. I appreciate that. I like to keep this thing going. I don't really do it for the money. If I did, if I was working for money, I'd go back and be a lawyer and do something I could really make money at. This is a labor of love. It's a lot of fun. I really like doing it. I like this mob history. I've been kind of remiss in not doing Kansas City since I first started this thing. So a lot of you, if you're on Apple Podcasts, they drop off after a while. So I talked about some of this stuff real early, like 6-7 years ago when I first started the podcast. So if you've heard this before, it seems familiar. Maybe you've seen my movie, or maybe you have, you listened to those early things, but most of you I don't think have. So I wanted to get this out, and I'm going to do that next mob war that came on the heels of this, the Spiro brothers, which I did the movie about brothers against brothers. And then I want to do one about the skim from Las Vegas from the Kansas City viewpoint. So I appreciate y'all turning in. Don't forget, I ride motorcycles, so watch out for motorcycles when you're out there on the street. If you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, go see our friend Anthony Ruggiano down in Florida, or go to his website and get that hotline number. If you have a problem with PTSD, and if you've been in the service, be sure and go to the VA website. They've got a hotline for that. And don't forget, if you're like and describe, if you're on YouTube, like and describe. Don't forget, if you're on YouTube, to like and subscribe down below. If you are listening to this on the podcast app, be sure you subscribe. I put one out or two out every week. I got, I don't know how many, depending on the app you're on, there's many as 400 and some back episodes that keep you entertained forever. If you got one of those jobs and you can listen to the podcast all night long. And I've had guys get hold of me and say, yeah, man, he said, I did this on my job so I could just listen to your podcast all night long. So I appreciate those kinds of compliments. I do the best I can. It's a lot of fun, and I really appreciate you guys tuning in.